Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Well, hello, Karen. Good to be back.
Good to be back, Dan. Happy summertime.
It is. Can't really tell if it's going to be as wet of a July as we had. We had kind of a dry end of June, but things picked up. But again, spotty. It's just
very spotty.
Not consistent. Like I had colleagues in Columbus this past week said they had about 5 inches of rain, and we got a little drizzle. I think I measured an eighth of an inch.
Yeah, we got hardly anything, and it's just frustrating because, the weather report says 75% chance of thunderstorms, 80% chance of thunderstorms, and then we get nothing. And I know there's a lot of gardeners and farmers that are kind of dependent on that rainfall, and so getting a little worried about getting some actual rain for our crops right now. So,
yeah,
but it'll come.
I think, depending on who you ask, they're going to be like, oh, yeah, it's going to be as wet as it was last year. And and then here we are kind of needing rain.
Yeah. Like you said, it's spotty. It all depends on where you are and your particular microclimate and where you are on the hillside, right?
Right. But there is one plant that we're going to talk about today that really doesn't care about whether it gets too much rain, too little rain. It never goes away. Obviously, it's going to be some kind of nuisance, right? And if you have a pasture field and you're in eastern Ohio, chances are you've seen this sweet-smelling shrub once or twice.
That's right. Yes, it is the autumn olive, and it really is a beautiful shrub. It has oval-shaped leaves that are a little elongated, and it has a beautiful silvery sheen on the underside of those leaves.
Lovely.
Oh, they're absolutely beautiful. They have beautiful white flowers in the spring and bright colored berries. But yeah, it's a really beautiful shrub. And it's also a royal pain in the tuchus.
Yeah, it's a beautiful problem. But definitely a problem for most people. Even, and it makes it hard to work property, whether, if you're a livestock owner and it's a pasture field, that's a nightmare for you. But even if you're not, and you just want to develop a part of your property, it's a nightmare. It's just, it was actually, so it's native to China and Japan, was introduced in the 1800s as an ornamental. And eventually, this was also when drilling was happening and it was in full swing and reclamation was kind of coming along. It was also found to be really good for wild habitat. It's a legume. It fixes its own nitrogen, fast growing, deep roots, helps with erosion, nice berries, like you were saying. The autumn olive has the red berries, and I want to say the Russian olive has the green berries, and that's honestly the biggest difference between the two. Management wise, and you're going to manage them the same, and it probably give you the same type of headache. I think one's a little bigger than the other, but can't remember what's what.
Now, the biggest problem with these shrubs is that they'll form this really dense thicket, which is just frustrating to deal with because you have all of these small stems inside of these wide-spreading shrubs, and it's just really hard to get in there to treat.
That's right.
Or to cut down or whatever. It's just frustrating to deal with.
And they're hardy, so these guys, like I was saying, they're nitrogen fixators, and they have the deep roots, so droughts don't really affect them too bad. They spread, they're dense, they're hard to get into, and they do like to come back from the roots. So cutting them, you can mechanically control small shrubs, but once it's large, those roots have so much reserves and they're so hardy and aggressive. Maintaining it, keeping up with it is a very, very difficult battle.
Right. And if you are going to want to do mechanical controls, it's really important to do it earlier in the year when the predominant flow of the stored sugars is coming up from the roots to make new leaves, new shoots, things like that. And once it's expended those reserves and you're going to go in and do some cutting or girdling, brush hog it, that's going to be more effective at that time of year.
Yeah.
So if you are wanting to go with a mechanical means, think spring.
Right. And another thing, we were talking about those roots being very good at regenerating and generating sprouts to basically just reestablish itself. If you are trying to pull up and dig the small plants, the recommendation is to do it when the ground is a little wet, so following a rain, so that you are able to pull up the root. Like, it'll slide better. It'll just prevent parts of the root from staying in the ground and then becoming a problem. The recommendation for cutting and mowing is most effective in early summer, like Karen was saying, when things were coming out of the roots into the shoots and the leaves.
Yeah, late spring, early summer. Yeah. And there's also, you can consider a biological control method. Goats love chewing on shrubs and brushes, and they do enjoy autumn olive along with multiflora rose as long as they're young. And so they can seriously defoliate and that shrub for you. They also tend to trample those young shrubs when they're lower. So also, using some targeted grazing can be helpful, especially on the smaller stuff.
Yeah, and that's what a great tool right there, especially even if you want to try to get in there and just be able to work on that plant a little bit better, because it does kind of grow at 360 degrees in all directions. I'm surprised there's not leaves underground, honestly. When you think,
do kind of need sunlight.
It shapes itself almost like a what do you call it? A hemisphere, right? Where it's just all the way around. So it's just difficult to get in there. And I've seen plants that it's considered to be a shrub. And Karen and I were talking about this earlier. Shrub / small tree, and I like to think of the word small in quotes because I've seen them keep up with some pretty big trees. You give them an open area and they will take it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they can seriously get up to 20 foot. And, that doesn't sound like much until you consider that that's taller than a one-story house. So yeah.
Yeah. And they grow just as wide, if not wider.
Oh, yeah. They can. And they also will sprout out of the root system. So you can get root sprouts, which causes them to spread even wider. And again, we get back to that thicket forming mentality of this plant where it just wants to cover as much area as possible. And so, it kind of brings us back to the idea that we've discussed on other shows of multi-species grazing and utilizing the different characteristics of different species to control different problem plants, and also getting them out there while they're young and rotating your pastures so that you can get these frustrating weeds when they're smaller and give you a better result on your control.
Yeah, so we did discuss, good times to be able to pull it out from the roots. And again, you're going to be able to do this basically if it's a small plant. If it's a large plant, you're not going to be able to get the roots out. Pulling it out when the ground's nice and wet, following a rain, not during the rain, because that's when accidents happen. Just everything becomes real slippery and difficult to see. So you don't want to do that. But you're trying to get as much root as possible when it's small. But once it gets to a certain point, you're going to be doing some chemical control. And there's different ways to look at chemical controls. We can look at foliar spraying, which is using a chemical on the leaves that gets absorbed by the leaves, and hopefully if it's a systemic pesticide, it'll translocate and kill the roots all the way to the shoot. Basal spraying is another method where you are putting the pesticide with a carrier that's able to penetrate the bark and get into the vascular tissue and translocate that way. Another thing that you can do is something called a cut stump treatment, where you cut it and you can either apply a water-soluble spray after you cut so that it's, again, directly absorbed into the vascular system and translocated down to the roots. Or if you don't have that on hand, or you're trying to manage it so that you're not cutting and spraying at the same time, another method would be to cut it and then do a stump treatment with a carrier like diesel. Diesel is a carrier that will penetrate after it's oxidized some. Just the same stuff that'll penetrate the bark will penetrate the stump following cutting. So, I don't know how many hours after cutting that you can't use water-soluble pesticides anymore, but typically I think you have to do it in the same day.
We usually recommend as soon as possible after about an hour, you've kind of decreased the ability of the vessels in the stump to pull down anything that's going onto them. So the wound reaction of a woody species is once that wound is open, it tries to close off as much of its circulatory system as possible to protect that tree from invading species, invading fungi, things like that. So it's going to try to close up its system as quickly as possible. So the sooner you can get it on there, the better. So a lot of times what we recommend is to go out with a friend and one of you cuts and the other one sprays or paints, as the case may be. Yeah. To allow for the greatest infiltration. But yeah, you have about an hour really for the best result.
Yeah, and that's with a water-soluble herbicide.
Yeah.
But if you're using kerosene as your solvent / carrier, whatever you're diluting your pesticide with, that does give you more time to work on the stump. So you can either work on the bark or you can work on the stump. And again, it's just how do you want to manage it? I mean, if you really just want to get it out of the way and give a good treatment, maybe you do want to go in there and start cutting, but the thicket, right? The thicket makes it difficult to get through everything in a good amount of time. So just different ways to do it. And your situation might be unique. So, take the best tools you have and along with the help and go for it.
Right. And there's two other methods that you can use with these woody type species, and that includes girdling, where you're going to remove that vascular tissue that's right underneath the bark. So you're basically trying to get to the cambial layer, the part that reproduces, and also the area that allows nutrients to get back down into the roots. So you're going to just cut it all the way around. But we have found, especially for larger things like tree of heaven, that going all the way around actually decreases the effectiveness of the herbicide you put on to that girdle cut. And so we've learned that you need to leave at least a portion of the bark intact so that it does think that it can still feed from that area and it will continue pulling things in. Another method that's a little less labor intensive is the hack and squirt, where you're going to use an axe or a hatchet to just make a small cut in the base of the tree, and you are going to pull the axe away from the trunk a little bit to create a little cup, and then you would put the herbicide in that little cup that you've created. And you do that in a couple spaces depending on how big your base is. Some of those trunks on autumn olive get pretty big, and that could be a potential method you could use.
Yeah, and I just want to point out one thing. So we're talking about all these different methods. A lot of times they do overlap in type of pesticide that is used. But one thing everyone needs to be very careful about is to read that label, because each method is going to require a different concentration, sometimes a different carrier, the different way to dilute the product.
Indeed, yeah, that's really important.
So one of the things that Karen was talking about, the hack and squirt, a lot of time that's done at a much higher concentration than something like a foliar spray.
Yes.
And we'll get into them more a little bit to the different things you can use and, some of the different types of products that are out there for foliar sprays versus everything else. But read that label and make sure you're aware that you're not using the same dilution for foliar spray as you would like a stump treatment or a hack and squirt, because they're going to be different. And that can make or break hours and hours of labor. So let's talk a little bit about foliar herbicides recommended for autumn and Russian olive control. Glyphosate is one thing that you can use, and as Karen was saying, there are the best times to do certain things, and there's even times when things might not work very well at all, depending on the physiology of the plant. But if we're looking at foliar application, typically we're looking at a window from June to September. When you're getting into October, you're kind of getting late on foliar application. Mm-hmm. But some of the things you can do for foliar applications are glyphosate, which is an example of glyphosate is Roundup. Again, follow the label, make sure that you are applying at the right concentration, and make sure that the leaves are green. Dead leaves don't absorb herbicide.
Nope.
So that kind of also is a good indicator of what window to use. So glyphosate Roundup is one product you can use. Another one you can use is 2,4-D with triclopyr. Triclopyr really being the product that I think has the most effectiveness in woody shrubs, but having 2,4-D as well does give you a double mode of action for control. So you can use 2,4-D and triclopyr as a foliar as well.
Yeah, an example of that would be like crossbow.
Right. Yeah, crossbow. Great product for something like woody shrub controls.
Yeah, woody problem.
You can use triclopyr by itself. Mm-hmm. They sell that solution by itself. And imazapyr is the other chemical that's typically used as a foliar recommended herbicide.
Yeah.
Again, they all have their labels and they're all going to be used at different concentrations. For the ones we name, typically we're going from 1 to 2%. And if you are reading the label, one thing you'll notice is depending on what weed you're trying to control, it'll give you a different concentration of the chemical. So, I'm just gonna guess that for most cases, when you're trying to deal with autumn olive and Russian olive control, the label's probably going to be recommending you in the high end of the legal dosage. But that is a guess. I think it's a very educated guess myself, but there might be exceptions out there.
Yeah, and if you're using this in a pasture field or a hay field, always make sure you're paying attention to any restrictions on grazing or haying that area after use of the chemical you've selected. We do have a good handout on this if you're interested from our extension specialists, Rakesh Chandran, and our Lewis County agent, Bruce Lloyd. They have a great handout on autumn olive, which has the different percentages for the different chemicals that are out there for foliar and also for the other treatments that we're about to discuss.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and move on to herbicides recommended for basal spraying. And this is both for autumn olive and Russian olive. And basal spraying is when you are able to get into the trunk area, so the thicket area, the base of the plant, where you want to typically coat about, depending on what you're trying to control, I've seen anywhere from 12 to 24 inches. Just at the base of the trunk, but in doing so, it can't be a water carrier because the water won't penetrate the trunk. So when you're doing basal sprays, you are working with some kind of hydrophobic compound like diesel fuel, kerosene is sometimes used, and there are other products out there that are a little bit more biodegradable. But you have to make sure that you are working with a product that is designed to penetrate the trunk and get into that vascular tissue. So for those things, we're still talking about things like triclopyr, which you also heard in the foliar application, imazapyr, 2,4-D, and triclopyr again, that combination. But these things are going to be at different concentrations. For instance, one of the recommendations for triclopyr is 4 to 10% solution in diesel, kerosene, or basil oil type treatment. So you're going to notice that there's going to be a difference between the foliar concentration and the basil spray concentration. But the idea is to coat the bottom end of the trunk so that it's able to penetrate in there. And that's typically about 12 to 24 inches, depending on the plant.
Yeah. And I'll second that. You want at least 12 inches. You don't really have to go up more than 24 is probably your maximum side of how much you need to get. You don't need to get the entire trunk. Just a foot or two, and you want to get the lowest part of the bark. And I do want to emphasize that it is a basil bark treatment. So your goal is to get it on the bark. It's not a soil drench where you're trying to hit the base around under the tree. I want to emphasize that you have to get it on the bark.
Because you said the word bark, it just popped in my head. It has to be a certain type of bark for this to use. And we are recommending it on autumn olive and Russian olive because it has that smooth bark. Once you get those, once you get a tree like, I guess I want to say kind of an ash tree, maybe even an oak tree type bark where it's very rough and coarse, basil treatments are not recommended. They're recommended for smooth barks.
Yeah, and they're also recommended for trees that are less than 6 inches in basal diameter. So once you get to your bigger trees, it's not as effective.
Yes, but a lot of times with those trees, once you cut them down, they're gone. But that's not always the case too, right? We were talking about an example, the locust. You can't just cut that down and be done with it.
Nope. Yeah, a lot of our Appalachian species are root sprouters and stump sprouters. And it's one of the regeneration techniques that our forests use. It's especially helpful for species that have been exposed to fire and things like that. It's just one of our species techniques. So, all right. So to go from the bark treatment to the stump treatment, like we mentioned earlier, you want to treat it as quickly after cutting as possible. But when you're looking at adding an oil-based dilution to it instead of the water-based, you do have a little bit more time on that for your treatment application.
Yeah, and so if we're using glyphosate as a stump treatment, like Karen said, immediately after you cut, within the hour, and you're applying at 20% glyphosate mix in water. So it's completely different concentration from what you do on foliar. But again, if it's going to be a water-based dilution or a solvent carrier, it's going to be immediately after you cut. And you're really striving for the outer ring, not the inside heartwood, because a vascular system is always going to be on the outside of the trunk, not on the center heartwood type part of the trunk. So when you're doing that, making sure you're getting a coating all the way to the edge, which is going to be critical for absorption into the vascular tissue.
Exactly. Yeah. And you want to make sure that it is getting into that vascular tissue, because that is how it gets into the root system, so that you don't have things like root sprouting and stump sprouting. So that is critical.
Yeah. And you can use a basil oil, fuel, diesel, kerosene type carrier on a stump treatment after the fact as well, similar to what you did with the basil treatment, except one of the advantages of doing it, I guess, in a cut stump type method is that it's gone. So you're able to walk around a little bit better through the thicket, as opposed to trying to get in there and moving branches out of the way, maybe getting smacked in the face by a branch coming at you as you're trying to get a little bit deeper in there.
Yeah. And you do want to be careful, and I often recommend using a dye for these types of treatments so that you know which stump you've gotten and which one you haven't, because with all of the stumps, it's really hard to tell. Once you get it cut off and you're looking at all of these little twigs that are left behind, it's kind of hard to tell which ones you've treated and not.
Yeah, and also make sure that you're using the proper dye for the proper chemicals, because a water-soluble dye doesn't work well in kerosene.
Good point. Very good point.
But but there are dyes for that, and it is a great marker. You're able to kind of see what you control, what you missed. Depending on how much of an area you're treating. Depending on the situation, the dye becomes more and more critical, especially if you're out in the woods and you're selectively treating certain parts. Knowing where you treated and what you did treat becomes a little bit more important than if you're just getting rid of everything in a certain area.
Exactly, yeah. And now I do want to point out, and this is especially important going back to our foliar spray, that you do want to be really careful with off-site or off-target application. So if it's a windy day or if it's really hot, some of those herbicides can actually cause problems on other plants around them. So you do want to make sure that the chemical that you're using is safe for the weather in which you're using it. And we just typically recommend don't spray on a windy day. And if you need to get out and get something treated, going out earlier in the morning is beneficial. Because that will get you out before the sun starts heating the earth, which causes the winds to increase. If you can't get out early morning, go out later in the evening. So most of the wind is going to be during the day. So if you think about our fire season, where you're not allowed to burn from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m., to 5 p.m., I think it is, then that is because that's when the wind is most active and more problems can occur. So they try to get you to burn in the non-windy times.
Yeah. And then the method that you're applying too. So if you're doing a foliar herbicide application, again, that's from June to about September, and it becomes really ineffective in October. But when you're doing a foliar application, you're trying to coat all the leaves, right? So you're going up high.
Mm-hmm.
When you're spraying high, that's when drift is most likely. So just like, boom height is always a very critical thing in drift, the lower, the less likely you're getting drift. So, just like a foliar spray, if you're spraying up high, chances are off target increases. If you're doing a basal bark or cut stump treatment, you can do almost year round, pretty much year round, even when it's dormant. You're just applying it to the base. You're applying low. You're applying less. You are working with higher concentrations, but it's a little bit more controlled area.
Right. And there's less potential for runoff and overspray.
Yeah.
Now, there is another treatment technique out there, another chemical you can use that you do apply to the soil. And this is tebuthron. It's also, like, the brand name is Spike.
Oh.
I will make sure that you know that there are potential issues with this chemical, in that if there are woody species near where you are treating, it will go through the soil and impact those roots as well, and can kill nearby trees. So you want to be extra careful when using this chemical, simply because there's a higher potential for off-target damage. And it does have a residual. It does stay active in the soil for a long period of time, I think 2 to 3 years. So
very long residual.
Do know about that.
Yeah, right. The chemicals that we talked about don't have a residual nearly that long,
right?
If at all, to be honest with you. And they are a little easier to handle, a little bit safer as far as off-target kills and damages. But yeah, that is another option. But again, just read the label, know what you're doing, and make a decision based on what you need it to do.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.